Hello and welcome to another review. Before we begin, two things. First of all, spoilers. So I do spoil some things in this, not major story things, but sort of like some big epic moments that you might be like, hey, I wanted to see that the first time while I'm playing. It's a double-edged sword though, because if you watch this review, I'm going to talk about how to actually enjoy this game to its fullest, because there's so many broken pieces to it spread out across so many different things that this review really helps you kind of wrap your head around all of that. So it's a trade-off. If you want to go in cold, go for it, but I actually think you'll enjoy Final Fantasy 15 more after this review, despite the fact that I spoil one or two things along the way. Secondly, exclusive to patrons, my graphic artist that I work with, extremely talented guy, has prepared another special edition of the script. I think it's his best work this time. It's available exclusively to patrons and also to YouTube sponsors. You can hit the sponsor button down below next to subscribe, and it'll give you access to that. I'll provide links and all that sort of stuff. Check it out. Thank you very much for waiting for this, guys. I've been working on this video for a few weeks, and I know I've been promising it, but it's finally here, and I really hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you later in the week for the Far Cry 5 review. Bye-bye. There's something so special about Final Fantasy. If you've ever come to it, especially in your younger years when Final Fantasy was in its prime, when Squaresoft were at the top of their game, it would undoubtedly have left a lasting impression on you. Final Fantasy wasn't just a series of games, it was the fullest expression of what video games were capable of as a medium. The most elaborate and compelling narratives, the most unforgettable characters, truly emotional moments, unparalleled scale, a level of visual beauty that no other studio could match, soaring symphonic scores, and underpinning all of this, an impossible imagination that breathed life into all of these things. We used to talk about Square the way we talk about CD Projekt Red now. There was an undisputed, irrefutable truth to the idea that these guys were the best at what they did, and that every new offering from them was something special. Like most things, that magic didn't last forever. After the phenomenally successful and critically acclaimed Final Fantasy X, Square began to lose their way. The realities of modern day games development meant that Square could no longer build and toss away these gigantic worlds it built, and it began to develop confused, tonally awkward spin-offs of sequels to its main games. It also saw the online gaming market as an opportunity, and before most of us even owned a PS2 online adapter or had internet good enough to make use of it, Square released Final Fantasy XI on the PS2 and the PC, a game that found a strong following, but that diverted much of its attention away from its core numbered franchise. With the Xbox 360 kickstarting the next generation of console wars in 2005, Square released Final Fantasy XII exclusively on the PS2 in 2006, and though it sold impressively, it failed to return Final Fantasy to center stage the way that Square had hoped. Hopes then turned to Final Fantasy XIII, the first game to feature a female protagonist and be released on both Xbox and PlayStation. The results were spectacularly disappointing.
Freaking fucking disappointed.
It actually defies the laws of both physics and logic by generating an even greater amount of suction than every other stale JRPG in existence combined.
I have never, ever wanted a Final Fantasy game to be a commercial flop. Ever. Until this very precise moment now.
I'm Scott Bromley, and I hate Final Fantasy.
At the core of the Final Fantasy experience is a sense of wonder at the world that you're set loose in. Final Fantasy was an open world game before that phrase even existed, and on top of a dull story and wooden characters, Final Fantasy XIII robbed us of that open world freedom, shuttling us down these dull corridors for what seemed like forever. It was the lowest rated numbered Final Fantasy in review history, both critically and in user scores. And Square's insistence on finishing the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy with 2 sequels did little other than to grate the patience of fans who were convinced that Square had lost its touch and that the magic of Final Fantasy would never return. Topping all of this off, Square hit its absolute low point in 2010 with the release of Final Fantasy XIV, an MMORPG that was just horrendous in every single way, bombing with both critics and fans, and being so bad that Square literally pulled it down, took down the servers, and rebuilt the game before its subsequent re-release. Square knew that Final Fantasy did not have the brand cash that it once did, and so back in 2006, one of Square's lead writers, Katsushige Nojima, the guy that wrote Final Fantasy VII and 8 and 10 and 10-2 and Advent Children and Crisis Core and Kingdom Hearts, he penned a new project known as Fabula Nova Crystallis, or the New Tale of the Crystal. Rather than specific characters or events, the concept aimed to create a number of themes or ideas that a new series of games would draw from. Things like the distinction between men and gods, and the origin of the world, and the significance of crystals, and other thematic underpinnings that we don't even know about because not all of them were released to the public. It was a clear statement, a punctuation point, that Square were ready to recapture the magic of the Final Fantasy series, and 2 headline games were planned for this series as the starting point: Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy Versus 13, a spin-off title that shared only the number in the title and a commitment to the very broad themes of the Fabula Nova Crystallis series. Tetsuya Nomura of Kingdom Hearts fame was the original director of this spin-off title, and he carved out a dark and emotionally wrought vision of a tale based on the darkly clad and brooding Prince Noctis fighting his way through hordes of enemies at the seat of his empire. The trailer was released in 2006, and anyone who's played this game will see how little of that core underlying vision changed during development. Noctis, his weapons, his abilities, his enemies, the setting, the music, all of it survived the 10 years until the game's release in 2016. There's a consistency that exists here in this vision that was protected during the development cycle, and as the game evolved away from being a mere spin-off to becoming a fully fledged numbered Final Fantasy game, that vision was protected because it was worth protecting. The world and the characters of Final Fantasy XV are some of the greatest that Square has ever produced and are unquestionably the main drawcard of the Final Fantasy XV experience. But a clear vision isn't always enough to help a game studio navigate the treacherous waters of game development. And the development of this Final Fantasy game will forever be remembered as one of the longest, most meandering, and most contorted in video game history. A new game director, a new name, complete restructuring of the development teams, a move to a new generation of hardware and a new graphics engine, and even additional studios brought in to help get the game out on time. It was a total mess from start to finish, and from almost any other studio the game would have been cancelled long ago. But Square were determined to see it through, and in November 2016, Final Fantasy XV was released to the world. Fans held their breath hoping that the wait would be worth it. Sadly, they would be disappointed. I'll begin my editorializing here by being as frank as possible. Final Fantasy XV, the product that was released in 2016, was a terrible video game, and I am stunned that it managed to garner an 81 on Metacritic. I'd never played it at launch, but I went back and played it this past few weeks as part of my review for the Royal Edition because I wanted to compare the original with how much it had changed over time. And I just could not believe that this product that was pushed out in this way wasn't completely flayed by the press and fans alike. Its shattered world building, spread out over a movie and a web series, meant I had no sense of what the world was about when I played the game, because I didn't know how much of that story existed outside the game. The bonds of brotherhood between Noctis and his crew that serve as the emotional core of the game are threadbare because the backstories and side quests associated with these characters was pushed to DLC rather than being made available in the core game. The combat was absurdly one-dimensional without even the ability to control your party members, and the game's narrative, the reason why you're doing the things at any point in time, just never makes sense no matter how much extra content you consume. I put down my controller at the end of Final Fantasy XV's story and just shook my head, certain that this was the worst Final Fantasy game I had played yet. It was at this point that I sought to fill out the experience by consuming all of the extra media associated with the game. I played the 2D side-scroller that introduces you to the main character's father, King Lucius, as well as other members of the story that you'll meet during the main game. I watched all the game trailers, which, believe it or not, are actually part of the game's canon lore. I read this weird script thing that exists for some reason. I watched all the Brotherhood YouTube videos, which give some backstory for each of the main characters. I watched the Kingsglaive movie, which sets up the events of the main game. And then I played through all of the DLC, including the various endings available at Episode Ignis. All told, the complete Final Fantasy XV experience spans 2 games, a movie, 5 YouTube videos, 4 DLCs, 1 script thing, 2 demos, 2 canon trailers, 3 alternative endings, and a partridge in a pear tree. And at the end of all of that time, that money and effort, I have to say that I really enjoyed my Final Fantasy XV journey, and I was sad to know that it was over. But that's the hard part, and the reason why it's taken me so long to produce this review. How on earth do you talk about a game that only becomes truly good when you consume all of this extra content that should have been included in the core game? It would be easy to swing a crude axe and just say that it's inexcusable, and that this product should be avoided because of how much money it demands from you in order to enjoy it properly. But the argument carries less weight now with the release of the Royal Edition, which packages all of the game's improvements and DLC for less than the cost of a full-priced game. But I think more than that. Final Fantasy XV has at its core an ambition that far exceeds the grasp of the developers trying to deliver on it. And it's that ambition that redeems the experience in the end. The product is broken, substandard, shattered, and confused in almost every regard, but it's also wholly unique and fascinating and captivating so long as you're willing to surrender to all of its failings and hold close to its rare fleeting moments of genius. Final Fantasy XV is an impossibly difficult game to love, but I found a way at the end of this journey to do just that, and today I want to share with you that journey in the hope that you might take something from it. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my review of Final Fantasy XV. We talk a lot about world building in video games, but it's a fairly complex idea that I think we gloss over a lot. World building is something distinct from character building or narrative or set pieces or even lore. It's a more ambitious endeavor that aims to bring together all of these things under one banner. It's the process of imagining a believable world and intersecting that with believable characters and believable events. If any of those things are incongruent from one another, then the whole experience breaks down and the world building is weakened. Square are master world builders. I'd even go as far as to say as they are the very best in the business, because no company has produced as many worlds as they have and to the level of quality that they have achieved. I mean, take BioWare for example, a company who for a long time were one of the most respected RPG developers in the world. Their earlier successes like Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, and Knights of the Old Republic were set in worlds that they didn't create. They didn't set themselves to the task of world building in earnest until Jade Empire, and then Mass Effect and Dragon Age, and now onto Anthem. So, smaller games aside, they've really only created 4 worlds with locations and characters and architecture and lore. Blizzard has only created 4 major worlds. There's Warcraft, StarCraft, Diablo, and now Overwatch. Bungie as well has 2 major worlds under its belt, Halo and Destiny. Bethesda has Fallout and the Elder Scrolls. My point is that the developers we know and love typically invest in a world and stick with it for a long time, adding more and more sequels to leverage their past work and to deliver more of what fans want. But for the best years of the Final Fantasy franchise, the exact opposite of this was true for Square. Square would create and throw out worlds with every new game it made, and each of them was as deep and as intricate as any other world that these other studios have created. It's, I think, the unsung miracle of the Final Fantasy magic. It's something we took for granted until Square stopped doing it and started giving us sequels we never wanted in ways we never wanted. In my view, it was Square's abandoning of this world-building courage that led to the decline of its brand over the last decade. I had worried that with Final Fantasy XV, it had been too long since Square had created a world worthy of the Final Fantasy name, and that they'd lost that talent. Luckily, I had nothing to worry about. If you take little else from Final Fantasy XV, it will likely be the memory of an extraordinarily well-built world. The Fabula Nova Crystallis DNA that fuels this game seems fundamentally different to that which spawned Final Fantasy XIII. Where 13 felt one-dimensional, 15 feels layered and textured and deep with meaning and intent. Where you wanted to rush through 13's corridors just to get it done, you're almost begging for 15 to slow down and share more with you, because you can feel that there's so much under the surface and you're only getting a small taste of it. The foundations of the conflict are your grounding. The evil, Magitech-wielding Niflheim have pushed back the peaceful Lucians to their world city Insomnia, protected by the power of the crystal. And on the eve of a historic signing of a peace accord between the two warring nations, Niflheim treachery sees the city walls come down and Insomnia fall to ruin. Prince Noctis, out of the city on his way to marry Princess Lunafreya, must find a way to bring down the Empire and restore his homeland. But the foundations of the world run far deeper than that. Your adventure throughout the game's open world will take you to truly spectacular locations, like the site where a meteor was to strike the ground were it not for an Atlas-like god that holds it up to protect mankind, or another location where a god was killed by the Niflheim so they could extract its power and study her. You'll raid ancient tombs to unlock ancient armature, your birthright as a Lucian king and the power to overcoming the darkness. You'll stumble headlong into these enormous creatures who pepper the land, bringing you close to them in a way that conjures the sort of emotions reserved for the likes of Shadow of the Colossus. It's a world of wonders at every turn, because the world building that's gone into all of this pulls from some of the old, familiar Final Fantasy threads that we know and love, but also because so much innovation and new thinking has gone into the creation of this world. But there's different ways to deliver world building, and this game, this Final Fantasy, chose to do that through the open world format. Previous Final Fantasy games have all been open world to an extent, but they've typically provided an overworld map which allows you to choose your destinations. Here, for the first time, Square gave us an open world in the way that we've become accustomed to over the last 2 console generations. And it's a shame that none of the vision of the world building has translated through to the design and utility of the open world itself. To be clear, the world of Final Fantasy XV isn't as open as you might think. It's really a rather small and sparsely populated map that's connected by roads. You tour it in your handsome car, the Regalia, which does have a rather stupid looking off-road mode, but generally it's limited to strictly staying on the road at all times. The car essentially drives itself in these instances, with you just choosing when to slow down or brake, or even choosing not to drive at all, since your companion Ignis is more than happy to do that. There's a lot of dead space on this map, and its horizons, its skyboxes, are actually far more interesting than the actual activities. There are wild enemies to hunt, random enemy bases to assault, tombs to plunder, but very little effort has gone into utilizing this space for much more than basic kill and collect quests. This is really one of the biggest weaknesses and missed opportunities of Final Fantasy XV. It's clear that this open world exists in this way as a direct response to the overwhelming feedback that Square received on Final Fantasy XIII, a game that everyone complained was far too linear. In responding to this, Square went where they felt most comfortable, the MMO space. Square has developed both Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV, both MMORPGs, and it's little surprise then that this world of Final Fantasy XV feels more like pointless MMO fodder than it does the lore-rich worlds of Skyrim or The Witcher 3. I've said it before and I'll say it again here, the thing that separates good open worlds from bad ones is the quality of the writing. If you give us a reason to be interested in the next stage of the quest, I won't mind doing something mindless because I know that there's a reward waiting for me at the end in the form of some juicy story drop. And this is why The Witcher and Skyrim worked, because the errands of the Mages Guild or the Bloody Baron were well-written errands, but errands nonetheless. Here, Final Fantasy XV doesn't even try.
One of our regulars told me they found something real special lying around. A rare can of car wax. Fella found it, but didn't have the foresight to grab it.
So we're supposed to venture out into the wild, find the wax, and bring it back.
That's the plan.
I mean, I literally have to go into the wilderness to find some wax? Like, wax. There are so many shitty quests like this that just phone it in when the game could be reaching deep into the beautifully written lore, the history of the gods on Earth, the conflict between the Niflheim and the Magitech, personal backstories of the named NPCs. Instead, we have bounty boards to kill random enemies and mindless kill quests for obscure, trivial reasons. So much opportunity is squandered here, and it's a real shame. I'll also make the important point that only half of your Final Fantasy XV journey will take place in this open world. At about the halfway point in the game, you'll be informed that you're about to cross a point of no return, and the open world is closed off to you after that until after you finish the game, or until you choose to sort of time travel back to the open world so that you can keep grinding and leveling while putting the main campaign on pause, sort of. It's really complicated, it's really weird, but that's how they do it. At this point, at the sort of point of no return, the game immediately pivots from being an open world adventure to being the kind of corridor simulator that fans dreaded in Final Fantasy XIII. If I was to hazard a guess, I'd say that this was to be the original structure of the game until the backlash from Final Fantasy XIII prompted a change of tact. It's why the second half of the game is narratively stronger but also tightly on rails, where the first half of the game makes absolutely no sense narratively speaking, but allows the player the freedom to choose to go where and whenever they like. The sudden switch from open world to corridors is whiplash inducing, but I'll be honest in saying that I actually enjoyed the second half of the game more than the first because I didn't like the way that Square designed their open world in this game. Final Fantasy has always been at its best when it's building incredible worlds for us to inhabit, but Final Fantasy XV demonstrates that Square has yet to master the link between world building and great open world design. I have 4 brothers. I'm the eldest of them, and we're all pretty close. Having that many brothers sort of makes you feel like you have your own personal posse wherever you go, and it's a really good feeling. So when I saw that Final Fantasy XV was going to be based around the road trip adventures of 4 dudes, I was like, alright, this should be really interesting to play through since I have my own experience to compare it to. If you speak to most people, even those that hated Final Fantasy XV, I think most of them will admit a bit of a soft spot for the 4 companions. The leader, Prince Noctis, your friend, the hot-headed Prompto, the burly, protective, big brother-esque Gladio, and the softly spoken and doting Ignis. So when I played through Final Fantasy XV, I really didn't feel much for these characters personally, and I think the biggest barrier to entry for me was the voice acting. I know I could have listened to it in Japanese, and in retrospect I wish I had, because it might have allowed me to get closer to the intention of these characters rather than feel distant from them at the hands of this wooden, overacting English dub.
Then, if you take something already delicious like cup noodles and add in the finest, freshest ingredients, what do you get? The ultimate flavor experience.
Now I know that most JRPGs have some pretty shitty voice acting.
Jen, don't tell me we're gonna have to hire some babysitters for this outing too.
What the hell? You look as much like a kid as I do, lady.
And as far as dubs go, the one in Final Fantasy XV isn't terrible, but it's definitely not good by any stretch of the imagination. I think I've just been spoiled by Nier Automata, another Japanese game that was so magnificently translated and voiced into English that I'd hope the days of Titus's laugh were forever behind us. I expected that with the scale of Final Fantasy 15, its budget, its stakes, that they could have delivered something great here, but they didn't, and so many of the best moments for me just lacked resonance at the hand of the English voice actors just belching out these awful lines.
Sick of this endless walking.
And I'm sick of your endless whining. Calm the hell down.
Get off my back.
Are you a man of royal blood, or aren't you?
It might sound like I'm nitpicking here with all this voice acting stuff, but I want to be clear that I'm not, because the characterization of these four dudes is so central to the Final Fantasy 15 experience. If you don't buy into who they are, it just becomes so much harder to stick with them throughout all of this, because unlike other Final Fantasy games, there's no other party members to switch in and out as you see fit. It's these four guys the whole way through, no exceptions. Ultimately though, it's the writing that holds these characters back the most. Both their actual dialogue and in terms of how much their stories is taken out of the main game and delivered through other mediums. Noctis is by far the worst of the whole bunch. You can't tell if this guy is a nice person or a spoilt prince. You can't tell if he respects his friends or not. You can't tell if his acceptance or rejection of an idea is in deference to the concern of others, or because he just doesn't give a fuck.
So Noct, haven't taken pics of whatever catches my eye, but what do you want to see?
What does it matter? Not my camera.
Yeah, I guess you have a point.
He's not ambiguous in the conflicted hero sense of the way, he's just badly written, and you'll likely come out of all of this caring about him the least. Prompto is actually a terrific character. He has the most fascinating childhood of all of them, and it links to Noctis in such an interesting way, and it has roots in the Niflheim Empire. It's just awesome, only you don't know that until you watch the Brotherhood web series on YouTube, and you play the episode Prompto DLC, which should be played at the end of Chapter 11 of the main game. Gladiolus is fucking boss. He's like the bigger brother we all wish we had, but all his lines in the game are just terrible and forced and just bad. And they really don't make any sense until after you've watched the Brotherhood web series and until you play episode Gladio DLC, which should be played at the end of Chapter 6 of the main game. When you play that, you learn his whole backstory and how deeply committed he is to protecting Noctis. His role as the King's Shield is something that the main game makes no effort to explain, and it's the absolute core of who this character is. And don't even get me started on Ignis, please. I don't want to get emotional. I promised myself I would not cry during this review. Ignis is just the most selfless, strong, uncomplaining protector of Noctis, willing to sacrifice anything, and I mean anything, to keep him safe. And of course, I had zero feels for this guy when I finished the game, but when I went back and played the DLC and I understood what he did for me and I watched the Brotherhood animated series, I wanted to frame a picture of this dude and put it on my wall IRL. There's an obvious pattern to all of this, and that's that the strongest parts of this game's characterization isn't in the main game at all, and it's in my view the best part of the entire Final Fantasy experience. Final Fantasy 15 is one of those rare games where the DLC is better than the main game because it delivers on what the core game promises. It brings you close to the stories of these four companions and sears their personalities, actions, and sacrifices deep into your memory. And even more than that, the DLC actually makes sense in a way that the main narrative never manages to. The Kingsglaive movie sets up a conflict between two empires that is resolved basically completely off screen as the narrative twists to reveal the true threat, the elusive Chancellor Arden. Now don't get me wrong, this guy absolutely steals the show throughout the game and will forever be remembered in my view as one of the great Final Fantasy villains. He is genius. He is one part court jester, one part smiling Cheshire Cat, one part anarchic Dark Knight Joker, one part American Psycho, cold-blooded psycho. This guy is the thread that weaves the entire Final Fantasy 15 saga together, but he spends so long leading you by the nose that part the way through the game you just give up trying to guess what his intentions are, and you just sort of resign yourself to knowing that you might know, you might never know, you just stop caring. And when it is all revealed at the end of it all, it's pretty cool I guess, but it doesn't make up for how much head scratching you had to go through to get there. A good twist is one that drops breadcrumbs along the way so that the audience can cleverly piece it together as they go. When you just confuse your audience for 28 hours and then drop some surprise, unhinted at bit of exposition in the final moments of the game, you really haven't done your job as a writer. If you want my advice, don't worry about the story in Final Fantasy XV. Focus on the world building and soaking it all in. Focus on the road trip crew. Watch the Brotherhood series on YouTube. Play all the rest of the DLC during the game, by the way, not at the end. And if you focus on all of those things and forgive the rest, you'll take something great from this experience. If you're trying to get caught up in the particulars of the story, you'll soon find yourself lost and confused and demotivated. It's sort of like a real-life road trip. Sure, there's a destination and you have to get there, but you're doing it wrong if you focus on that too much. Focus on the stops along the way. That's the secret to a good road trip, and that's the secret to a good time with Final Fantasy XV. So I've spent a hell of a lot of time talking about the world building and the open world and the story and the characters and all this other stuff. When the hell am I going to talk about the actual game? The buttons that you press, the combat, the real gameplay. Where's that part of the review, huh, Skill Up? Well, this is the section, but there's a reason I left it to last. There really isn't that much to speak of, and the gameplay systems on offer here are easily the most one-dimensional and anemic of any Final Fantasy game I've ever played. Let's unpack that, shall we? No game has done more to further the turn-based JRPG formula than Final Fantasy. Turn-based combat is something that we think of as very Japanese nowadays, but it was actually the West that pioneered modern-day turn-based combat through the Dungeons & Dragons pen and paper style games that bloomed in popularity in the late 70s and 80s. With the success of Dungeons & Dragons, Western video game developers began adapting those same concepts and rules to the world of video games, but Japan lagged behind, seemingly uninterested in this rigid style of play until the release of Dragon Quest in 1986 and the release of the original Final Fantasy in 1987. Seemingly overnight, the JRPG was born, and Japanese developers continued to develop to this format for decades more, even as Western developers rapidly moved away from the rigidity of turn-based combat, embracing more real-time action RPGs. For more than 3 decades, Final Fantasy evolved its approach to turn-based combat further and further, the greatest innovation being the active time battle feature, which brought a sort of real-time-esque feeling to what was earlier a simple your turn, my turn rhythm of combat. Characters could invest into stats and usabilities that would allow their ATB bar to refill faster, meaning that combat began to feel more dynamic than before. But even up to Final Fantasy XIII, combat in Final Fantasy was strictly a turn-based affair. In parallel to the more recent Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy XV's original game director, Tetsuya Nomura, overheard a conversation with Hinorobi Sakaguchi, the creator of the whole Final Fantasy franchise, and he was talking about the fact that he wanted to make a game with the freedom of movement that Mario 64 had, but he lamented that only Disney characters were as popular as Mario, so he thought it'd be a waste of time. Nomura suggested that they speak to Disney to make that game, and so they did, and Kingdom Hearts was born. The defining aspect of Kingdom Hearts, other than just being like the best thing ever, is the movement and fluidity of its combat. With its hero effortlessly moving about these large, 3-dimensional spaces in real time, executing long combos suspended in midair. This couldn't be further from the rigid, feet planted on the ground, turn-based combat of Final Fantasy, and fans absolutely loved it. When Nomura took the reins of Final Fantasy Versus 13, which would later become Final Fantasy 15, he immediately brought the DNA of Kingdom Hearts into the world of Final Fantasy 15 for the first time, completely abandoning the tactical turn-based foundations of the series. The results were very mixed. So, let me break down how combat works for you. First of all, this fucking cool song kicks in. How cool is that? Okay, so at this point, it's time for Prince Noctis to engage. He has this awesome move where he throws his sword and then teleports to wherever he lands or strikes. The further he throws it, the more damage it does. When he's on top of his target, you then hold down the circle button and begin executing these automatic combos. You don't have to do anything, you know, just hold down the circle button and you just start swinging wildly. That's all there is to it. To avoid attacks, you simply hold down the square button. Again, you don't have to time this or do anything. You just hold it and you can continue to hold it and dodge everything that comes at you until you run out of mana, because doing that consumes mana. Throwing your sword or dodging all consumes mana, and to recharge this, you have to find a distant resting point by panning your camera around and then waiting for the game to give you this warp prompt. And then you throw your sword to that location, and when you arrive there, you'll immediately regain huge amounts of mana and health. So the ultimate rhythm of combat is to warp in, maybe strike a few times with an automated combo, warp out to recharge, warp back in, rinse and repeat. You can switch weapons on the fly, by the way, while you're doing all of this, which does bring some minor benefit, but you'll typically find yourself just sticking with the one weapon most of the time, since it gives you everything you need to get the job done. There's magic as well, but its implementation is woeful for reasons that I won't even waste time describing. Trust me, the magic system in this game is so bad that it's practically useless, and most people just never even end up using any magic at all. I certainly didn't, or like, I did just to learn how it worked, and then I was like, no, that's garbage, I'm not going to use that anymore. Party members is another thing in this whole equation. Up until December of last year, so that's December 2017, you could not control your party members in combat. You just couldn't do it. They were these automated bots that basically did nothing. There was the opportunity to command them to use special abilities, but these had these really annoying, long-winded animations associated with them, meaning that it was actually typically more efficient just to not bother with those and just handle all the fighting yourself. The December update added the ability to switch between all 4 characters at any time during combat, and it does vastly improve your enjoyment of combat, but it doesn't make it any more deep or tactical. And that's for the simple reason that there really isn't any need for tactics at all in this combat system. The automated combos, the automated blocking, the useless magic system, the pointlessly diverse weapons, the auto-targeted warping means that you just don't need to engage your brain at any time when playing this game. I wish it were otherwise. I know there are a lot of people that try and argue that there actually is all this depth to this system and you just need to work to uncover it. And maybe that's true, but there's just no point. You can face roll through this entire game without ever turning any of your attention to the depths of that combat system, and you will do just fine. For me, that right there is the measure of a system. Whatever depth might exist over the top of that base level requirement really just becomes academic at that point. Turn-based combat is one of those things that you either love or you hate it, but if you like Final Fantasy games, you probably like turn-based combat. This, more than anything else, makes the whole decision to abandon it altogether a little baffling, especially when what replaces it offers little in the way of depth. Every time you load up in Final Fantasy 15, a screen flashes up that reads, "A Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers." I suspect that this aspect of the game, the combat, more than any other, is the most notable manifestation of that ethos. Beyond that though, the one-dimensionality that defines the combat extends to the rest of the game systems as well. The progression tree unlocks new stats to make your numbers bigger, or new party abilities that you probably won't use. There's only a handful of weapons available to you throughout the main story, and though I know that there are more to collect at the end game, I really struggle to see the point other than just for the bragging rights. There are very few dialogue options that have a meaningful impact on gameplay outcomes. There's nice gimmicks like leveling up your cooking skill of Ignis or your personal fishing skill if that's your thing. There's no new party members though to find, no side quests to do with those party members, to dig into their personal stories more deeply, or to unlock new combat abilities for them, or whatever. The whole thing, the whole game, is just so streamlined down to the point where the whole experience feels decidedly on rails. I'm not talking about the story or the world, I've covered that earlier. I'm talking about the gameplay experience, just feels so guided. Recently, I reviewed Kingdom Come Deliverance, and in researching that game, I came upon a quote from one of the producers, where he was talking about how AAA games these days are made for absent-minded players, and that games sort of play themselves. I couldn't help but feel that Final Fantasy 15 is the very definition of the game that plays itself. It's something that's experienced more than played, and while I know some people might love that aspect, I found it really dull, and I yearned for the deeper, richer, and more challenging Final Fantasy combat and game systems I remembered from all those years ago. As I look back over this review, I realize that it's probably sounding fairly schizophrenic at this point, with me talking about world building good, open world bad, characters good, voice acting bad, DLC good, story bad, villain good, gameplay bad. I get it. So let me just try and make it really clear. The world of Final Fantasy XV is wonderful. It's among the best that Square have ever designed. However, the open world game systems don't make use of it in the way that it deserves. The characters in Final Fantasy XV are among the best that Square has ever developed. However, their best stories are ripped from the core game and shoved into DLCs and YouTube videos. The villain that conducts the symphony of events is among Square's best, but the symphony he's conducting is a confused mess of events and plot twists that ring hollow at every turn. And the core gameplay loop does little to redeem all of these shortcomings, feeling dumbed down and unengaging, though admittedly it serves as a means of making the game more accessible to those that don't enjoy turn-based JRPGs. And so now you can see why it's so hard to write a review about this game. For every towering achievement, there's these major shortcomings that pull the rug out from whatever's been accomplished. There is, however, one final point that I wanted to make at the end, and I think it's the most important point. It's about how to let Final Fantasy XV in when there are so many reasons to reject it based upon all of these shortcomings. See, I finished Final Fantasy XV, I watched all the extra stuff, I did all the things, but even after all this, I felt like I still wasn't getting it. I felt like I had all of the pieces in my hand and I knew what they were, and I understood why some people truly love this game, but I just felt like it wasn't doing anything for me. So I kept looking, I kept trying to find the reason that this game had resonated with so many people. Now, one of the things I do when I review a game is I listen to the soundtrack 1 or 2 days before I start writing. I just have it on repeat while I'm doing anything else, while I'm walking, while I'm going to the gym, playing other games, whatever. And I do this because I really feel that a game's soundtrack often gives you the clearest sense of what a game is trying to do. So much can get lost or muddled in the development process. Stuff like buggy code or lip sync issues or animations breaking or gameplay loops that just aren't fun. But music is a very pure contribution to the video game art form. A composer receives instruction from the game's director on what they want to communicate during battles or cutscenes or menus or whatever, and the composer just goes off and creates that, free of any of the distractions we associate with typical games development. So I start listening to the Final Fantasy XV soundtrack in preparation for this review, and I'm listening down the playlist on YouTube, and I'm remembering all these moments throughout my journey, and which song went with which town, or which theme belonged to which character, when eventually I reach this song, Apocalypsis Aquarius. I could try to describe its significance to you, but I think it's better if you just hear it for yourself. It plays during one of the most climactic moments in the entire game, a battle against a gigantic Leviathan. And I know this footage looks extremely impressive, but I shit you not, all I'm doing here is holding down the circle button. I wish I was joking, but I am not. This segment hands you this whole new control scheme without explaining any of it to you, and it's unbelievably mindless. It's just bad, and I remember thinking as much when I was playing it, but I also remember feeling totally overwhelmed by this scene with its particle effects and its speed and its scale, and the incredible music just thundering away in the background, making everything I do feel that much more epic. So I'm listening to this song and all these memories were flooding back, and I noticed one comment in the comment section that just made everything click for me. And when I say everything, I mean everything. The entire Final Fantasy XV experience just fell into place for me when I read this, and it was at that point that I felt ready to write this review. And it read, 90% people's reaction to this fight, I feel it, I don't know what I'm doing, but I feel it. It was the most upvoted comment on the video with dozens of comments, all of them agreeing with this sentiment. One guy put it perfectly. Haha, right, this game is a mess, which was followed by this, but we had fun playing it, and that's the point of playing video games. I searched far and wide for a way to understand and like Final Fantasy, for a way to let it in, and I found the answer in a YouTube comment section of all places. Final Fantasy XV is a total mess of a game, but if you're willing to accept its weaknesses, as many others have, and cling to its strengths, and have the patience to sit through all of the different pieces that comprise the experience, there's a quality to it that will eventually melt your heart. And you'll find yourself looking back on that road trip adventure that you had with your 3 buddies, wishing that there were more stories to tell. Final Fantasy XV is one of the worst games that I have ever loved, and that's really all the proof that I need that the experience is far greater than the sum of its parts.